So I'm not exaggerating when I say that the moment that I learned that I could use my stainless steel skillet to cook in a no-stick way, I donated all of my Teflon. I'm not saying you should do the same thing, but I have really not looked back since that day, and that was like years ago. I use it to make crepes. I use it to make scrambled eggs. As long as you know how to use it correctly, you can use it for literally anything. So I'm gonna teach you how to do that. I have a video in my blog post that'll show you how to make scrambled eggs in a stainless steel skillet. And in this post, I'm going to just explain some of the reasoning behind that technique. Why does it work? How does it work? Let's get into it. Okay, so best practices for using a stainless steel skillet. Number one, this is a really annoying one. I am so sorry. I'm a minimalist. I don't like telling people to buy stuff, but you've got to start with a quality pan. What do I mean by quality? I don't mean like the most expensive pan you can get your hands on. I have kind of a pricey one. Mine is a 5-ply Lagostina, but I've also used like 3-ply Cuisinart ones that are like $30 a pop that are not that expensive, definitely relatively affordable, as long as it has those like 3 layers of aluminum, stainless steel, and another layer of stainless steel with that kind of sandwich of aluminum on the inside. That is what you're looking for. If you can get a 5-ply one, like the one that I have, even better, but you can get really good results even with like kind of a mid-tier pan. But it has to be something more than just sort of those like dorm room $1 IKEA pans. The next thing you've got to know is your stove's sweet spot. And this is a thing that I think most guides to cooking with stainless steel don't really get into. They say, oh, like just heat your pan so that water dances across the surface, but don't let it get too hot or you're going to scorch your oil. And guides like that are absolutely correct. That's true. If you let your pan get too hot, it is going to scorch the oil and you're going to have to start over. It could even be dangerous. It could catch on fire. And if you don't let it get hot enough, everything is going to stick. It's going to be a huge mess. So the question is, how do you find that sweet spot? So if you are just cranking the heat to high and then just waiting until the moment that the water dances across the surface, you're probably going to breeze right past it. It's really easy to miss. So what I like to do is just spend some time figuring out what is the sweet spot of your stove. So what is that kind of medium-low temperature where you can just park your pan there, let it preheat for like 7 minutes, 10 minutes, 15 minutes, and it's not going to overheat because it's like the perfect temperature to maintain that, water dancing across the surface without getting too hot and holding on to too much heat. So the way to figure this out, it depends on if you have gas, electric, induction. Everybody's stove is a little bit different, but you want to just let your pan preheat for like 7 minutes for gas, 3 minutes for induction, 10 minutes for electric, and you want to preheat it over medium-low heat until the water dances across the surface. Once your timer goes off for that initial preheat, the water might not be dancing. And that tells you something. That means that you are using heat that's a bit too on the low side. So you need to crank it up just a little bit and then wait another 5 minutes, try again and see if now the water is dancing. If it is, you found the sweet spot. If it's still not dancing, it's still too low. Let's say that when you do this, that initial preheat is up and you test it and the water is dancing right out of the gate. Great. Problem is it might be too hot. So now you want to just kind of dial it down. You want to wait 5 minutes. You want to see, can I get away with lowering the heat a little bit? Like, was this maybe too hot? Test it again. See if the water is still dancing across the surface. If it is, maybe lower it a little bit more. Wait a few more minutes. Test it out. So you just kind of want to keep going back, testing it, seeing like what is the absolute lowest temperature that you can keep it at where water still dances across the surface. This takes like 10 to 20 minutes. You're probably going to get it right on like the second try, maybe the third try, but it really doesn't take that much time. And the key is once you have it figured out, you like never have to do this again. You'll just figure out like, oh, this is the sweet spot of my stove. I know this is what I need to set it at if I'm preheating my pan, and then you'll just do it that way every time. Okay, so let's talk oil. If you master the sweet spot of your stove, you can get away with using extra virgin olive oil. Like in the egg recipe video in this post, I'm using extra virgin olive oil there, and you can see it's not smoking, it's not going crazy, and yet nothing is sticking. If you're really using that lowest temperature possible where the water is still dancing, you can get away with using a slightly lower smoke point oil. If you're not yet a pro, if you're a little bit worried that you might be overheating your pan, avocado and canola oil are your friends. Those are going to be a lot less risky. They're going to be less likely to smoke. If your pan is really overheated, they're still going to smoke. They don't have like infinite smoke points. You also want to use enough oil depending on what you're cooking. So if I'm doing eggs, I like to do this sort of 2-pour method that I've created where I pour in a pretty generous glug, then I wipe out a lot of that oil so that it's coated in a very thin, even layer. Then I add a little tiny drizzle of oil and I proceed. If I'm cooking something like potatoes, which are going to absorb a lot of that oil, I use a way more generous pour. So I'll actually kind of just, pour a big glug, swirl to coat. It just kind of depends on what you're cooking. Okay, another important step in this process. You've got it on medium-low heat on that like sweet spot. Once you add the oil, you want to crank it up to high. You don't want to do this too early because if you leave it on high, that oil is definitely going to start smoking. But you just kind of want to preempt the fact that you're adding cold or room temperature ingredients to a hot pan. They're going to immediately start cooling it down. So you want to combat that by increasing the heat right at the beginning of adding those ingredients. If the cook time is really quick for something like eggs, I usually just leave it at high. If you are cooking something more like meatballs, potatoes, a burger, something that takes like several minutes to actually cook all the way through, you just want to keep it on high at the beginning of the cooking process and then gradually reduce that heat to make sure that nothing's burning, that everything is getting a really nice sear, and just be careful and cautious about like how you're controlling that heat. And if you're working with ingredients where you need to flip them or turn them like meatballs or a hamburger, you might need to boost that heat back up as you're flipping them just for like a little bit to make sure that the other side doesn't stick. And at that point, you also might want to add a tiny bit more oil to the pan right before you flip them. Speaking of adding ingredients, while you're adding ingredients, you don't want to crowd the pan. So you want to kind of be able to see the bottom of the pan peeking out from between all of the meatballs or all of the potatoes or whatever it is that you're cooking. You don't want to cook more than 2 to 3 eggs at a time. If you are trying to make eggs for a crowd, it's still actually really easy because you don't have to let the pan cool down. You don't have to wash it between batches of eggs. So you can kind of just have a big thing, pour a bit into the pan, cook them up, move those to a plate, and then just keep the process going. When we're talking about like agitating eggs or flipping burgers or turning meatballs, you want to make sure that you don't turn or agitate your ingredients too soon. You want to make sure that they actually get that nice sear or start developing those like curds of eggs before you actually start messing with them. So if you dump the eggs in and you just start getting in there and like mixing everything around really chaotically, really aggressively, you're probably going to end up having some sticking. So you want to just kind of agitate things a little bit cautiously, a little bit carefully. Don't add the meatballs to the pan and then immediately start trying to turn them. You want that first side to get a nice sear. And now this next one is kind of funny because when you're making scrambled eggs in a nonstick skillet, of course you have to use a silicone spatula because you don't want to scratch the nonstick coating. When you're making eggs in a stainless steel skillet, a silicone spatula is the absolute worst possible thing you could ever use. Let me actually get one. I'm going to show you. Okay. Silicone spatula. So what's the problem with this utensil? It has this really even edge that you can use to basically squeegee the bottom of the pan. What happens if we squeegee the bottom of the pan? We very efficiently push all of that oil to the side. That thin layer of oil that we so carefully tried to create at the beginning of the process, we're removing it with the silicone spatula. You're going to get some sticking if you do that. Instead, you want to use chopsticks, a fork, even a spoon, anything that doesn't have that kind of like squeegee edge. And another specific tip for cooking things like eggs, whether it's like crepe batter or scrambled eggs, anything like that, when it's like a liquid going into the pan, you want to do it in a sort of circular motion as you're adding the liquid. You don't want to just dump the liquid into the pan. If you do that, you're going to create a cold spot on your pan in the spot where you added that liquid, especially if your eggs are like really cold straight from the fridge. But even if they're room temperature, you're going to be creating a cold spot on that spot. So you want to do it in like a circular pattern so that you're kind of hitting each part of the pan pretty evenly with that pour. And finally, clean it like you mean it. Maintaining a stainless steel skillet is way easier than maintaining a cast iron skillet, which even a cast iron skillet's not that hard, but you just want to wash it normally. I throw mine in the dishwasher every time I use it, but just about like once every week or two, I do give it a scrub with some either Bon Ami or some Barkeeper's Friend. So a more kind of abrasive cleaner and kind of a scrubbing pad. So you want to use a sponge sort of like this one. It's made of plastic, but it does have that sort of abrasive scrubby texture. So it's not going to like scratch up the surface of the pan. And keeping your pan really clean is the kind of thing that prevents sticking. So like if there is that like residue building up over time, it's going to make it less effective when you go to cook with it. It's sort of the opposite of a cast iron skillet. You don't want to have that like layer of seasoning building up in the way that you would with a cast iron skillet. You want it to be super shiny, super clean. And finally, what do you do if everything just goes wrong? It happens. Sometimes I'll be like cooking in an Airbnb, completely underestimating or overestimating the stove. I have no idea idea what I'm doing, or sometimes I'll just kind of lose track. I'll preheat the pan for like 2 to 3 minutes instead of the full preheat time. Everything ends up sticking, or the oil starts smoking. So what do you do in these two cases? If everything is sticking to your pan because you didn't heat it enough, you want to get a metal spatula and start scraping. Wait for it to kind of like sear a bit on one side and give it a scrape. I've done this with eggs before. It's not ideal, but it's edible. It doesn't taste bad. You could just start over too if the ingredients like aren't expensive and you don't mind. But sometimes, yeah, I'll just get in there with like a metal spatula and give it one good scrape, add a bit more oil, and then flip it back into the pan and hope for the best on the other side. If you're making something meaty like meatballs and your meatballs are sticking like crazy, you didn't let it preheat long enough, ugh, such a nightmare, make lemons out of lemonade and just think of it as an opportunity to create a really good pan sauce. So the more of that meatball that is like sticking to the pan, the better the pan sauce is going to be, as long as you don't burn those bits. So do your best to keep them together, do your best to flip them, and then deglaze the pan with a little bit of water at the end and turn it into a really good pan sauce. If you overheat your pan and it is smoking, you just need to start over. And you need to be safe. Hot oil can catch on fire. This can be like a safety hazard. I linked to an article in the blog post about how to put out a grease fire. I think it's just really good knowledge for any home cook to have. Like, we should all know how to deal with these emergency situations. I'm definitely not an expert on dealing with emergency situations, so I would read some articles about it, figure out what you're supposed to do, and have that memorized for if that does happen. If your pan is just smoking and it's not on fire, you want to put the lid on it and just put it off the heat to the side, wait for it to cool down, wash it out, and start over. It's not very pleasant, it's not very fun, but that's really just the best thing to do at that point. But once you figure out how to use your pan, how to use your stove, it's not going to be like smoking on you all the time. When you figure out that sweet spot, you're not going to miss it. It's just really easy to maintain, and you're going to have really good eggs with no sticking, no Teflon, just like a stainless steel skillet. It's so easy.